All right, everyone, welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is Nick Giordano here, and I have a great guest coming on. Before I introduce him, make sure you go to the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, share this episode with family and friends, and subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. With that out of the way, I want to welcome Mark Meckler, the president of the Convention of States. Mark, welcome to have you here. How are you today?
I'm great. It's good to be with you, Nick.
I'm glad you can be here. It's a big week for the Convention of States. Now, before we actually jump into what's going on this week, I want you to talk about the Convention of States, what it means, why it's important. I did an episode a while ago on the convention, and I think it's something that everyone needs to know about. So give the audience a quick, brief intro about what a Convention of States does.
Yeah, so here's the brief primer. And by the way, if you haven't heard of this before, welcome to the crowd. Most people are unfamiliar with this. It's contained in Article 5 of the United States Constitution. The second clause of Article 5 says that if we want to amend the Constitution, we can do it as states, and we can start the process. See, all 27 amendments that we have to date were all initiated by Congress. 2/3 of both houses propose an amendment, goes out to the states for ratification. The problem with that process in today's world is Congress is never going to do anything we want them to do. We'd like them to limit their power. We'd like them to impose term limits on themselves. We'd like them to get their fiscal house in order and balance their budget. And they're never going to do any of that. All of that stuff can be done by constitutional amendment. And so the way that works is when 2/3 of the states decide that they'd like to gather in convention, they pass applications. Those applications are passed in both houses of a state. Doesn't require a governor's signature because it's what's called a resolution. It's not a piece of legislation. And when 2/3 of the states agree to do that, then the states gather in convention. They debate proposed amendments. If they can get a simple majority of the states to agree, that's 26 states, then what comes from there is a simple suggestion. It's just a suggestion of proposed amendments that then goes out to the states for ratification by the same process that would be if it was a congressional recommendation. And so our organization, Convention of States, at conventionofstates.com, we're proposing a convention of states and amending convention, which would talk about three things. One, any kind of term limits that you would want to impose on DC. That's Congress. That's the one most people think about. But it's also the deep state. I call it the Fauci Amendment, right? We don't want people working in DC for 40 years and then controlling everything from inside the deep state. So it could be staffers and bureaucrats. Also judiciary. Second would be anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. That's financial restraints like a balanced budget amendment, tax caps, spending caps, imposing generally accepted.
You're trying to say Congress spends too much money.
If we don't know that now after the last debt ceiling fight, we're never going to know it. You know, it's funny. There was a fight actually to have a convention for a balanced budget back in 1982. So you were just a couple of years old. We got to 32 states at that point, so almost to the threshold of 34 necessary states to call a convention. It was defeated by some on the right, working with some on the left. We had a $4 trillion debt back then. So, I mean, today that would be a fantasy to have that debt that low. It's now over 32 trillion. So we can impose fiscal restraints. And then the last thing, my favorite, we can impose scope and jurisdiction restrictions. And what that means specifically is we can say no to particular areas of power the federal government's taken over, like in education or in energy or in healthcare and the environment. These are all areas where the federal government was never meant to be involved. They've taken that power onto themselves. It's been affirmed by the courts, and we can strip that power away.
And that's such a great point, because the founding fathers, they put this in as a way to bypass Congress and the federal government. So when the states actually put in the application to hold the convention, Congress cannot deny that, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Congress has a role. It actually says in the Constitution that Congress names the time, the place, and the method of ratification. So time and place, they're going to pick, I assume, Washington, D.C. Time, we don't know how soon they will call for that. I do worry they could impose and say, you know, we're going to do it in 5 years or whatever. But the states constitutionally retain the sovereign power to gather at any time they want. So if Congress tries to delay it, I think the states will just gather. And then method of ratification, there are two potential methods. One is just legislative ratification, the same way they call for it. That's been done in all but one of our 27 amendments. The other way is what they call state ratifying conventions. And those conventions are essentially whatever the state wants to make them be.
And in order to approve the amendments that come out of the convention, it would be 3/4 of state bodies, whether it's through the legislative body or the ratifying conventions, that would need to approve it, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So this is an incredibly high bar. This process contains the highest bars in the American system of governance. In other words, nothing else requires 2/3 of state legislatures just to be able to talk about it, 3/4 to ratify an amendment. It's a very difficult process. The founders intended it to be slow and difficult because they didn't want the Constitution being amended willy-nilly.
Absolutely. I mean, Madison argued that if you could just amend it willy-nilly, that the Constitution will be rendered useless within a few years. And Alexander Hamilton actually said that the reason that it's so important and the reason that the threshold is so high is to essentially prevent the encroachment of a national government on the state governments. Now, this concept of federalism is really important because that's what you're talking about here. You're talking about the principles of federalism, where we have the federal government responsible for its duties, and then the state government. But over the years, the federal government has constantly intervened in the state affairs. I call it extortion because they use a lot of federal tax dollars, our taxpayer money, to get involved in these areas. But we've seen Congress that is all too willing to grant the bureaucracy more and more power, and they don't actually use their power of oversight to rein these agencies and departments in. So the regulatory aspect of a convention of states, when it comes to actually pushing back against these regulations, what do you think could be done through the convention?
Oh man, so many exciting things. That's my favorite part. I mean, people like to talk about term limits and balanced budget, and those things might be important, but stripping away the administrative state, I think, is the most. The administrative state, in my opinion, is entirely unconstitutional. Congress has delegated lawmaking authority to these administrative agencies. There's no authority for them to do that in the Constitution. So, and I think we see the runaway administrative state, now what we call the deep state, right? I think that came out very clearly in the Trump era. And so there are a lot of things that we could specifically do. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. The Department of Education has spent hundreds of billions of dollars since it was enacted, since it came into being. The Department of Education is not authorized by the Constitution. There's a precisely 0% increase in test scores since the advent of the Department of Education, since they started taking money away from the states, in my opinion, illegally. Then they send it back to the states with conditions on it, which make our education systems worse. States and localities know how to use it better. Jefferson actually said in a letter to William Henry Lee that he couldn't get public money for the University of Virginia when he was founding it because it was unconstitutional, because there was no education provision in the federal Constitution. So we could say, for example, to the federal government, no, you may not be involved in education. You can't spend any money. You can't regulate it. You can't talk about it. We could do the same in other areas. Another area that I think would be really important is in healthcare. Federal government was never meant to be involved in healthcare. What's called the police power is generally reserved for the states. Healthcare falls under the police power. States are much better suited to understand what kind of healthcare is needed in their own state, not something that should be done by the federal government. So we could say, no Department of Health and Human Services, no National Institute of Health. If states want to work on this stuff, they can. If they want to cooperate, they can do so. There's an authority in what are called interstate compacts. They're happy to cooperate. They can contribute money to a common pool and research and efforts, but we need to get those kinds of things out of the hands of the federal government.
And let's be honest, the states are the laboratories of experiment, right? Every state is going to try their own policies. And if the policies work, other states may adopt it. But if it's a catastrophic failure, then other states will know to stay away from it. I say, like, universal health care. Well, let California do it. They can do it on their own. And if it fails, well, at least we didn't screw it up for the other 49 states. But the intent of Sum and Power is to bring all the power to the federal apparatus. And that's why when you look at the Convention of States, can you just, we know it's a difficult bar. That's the way it was intended. I mean, we have 27 constitutional amendments, as you stated, all passed through the way most people know how it's passed. None through the Convention of States. Now, there are opponents to this that say, well, what happens if the Convention of States, it's a runaway convention, and they actually just end up redrawing the entire Constitution? How do you explain to them that that's actually not correct, that that's not going to happen, that it would be actually almost impossible for something like that to take place?
Yeah, I mean, I would start with, it's important, especially as a conservative, I like to have a foundation for everything I argue. I want to know where my arguments come from. I'm not just going to say it because I read it on the internet or heard it from some guy. And so, first of all, it's important to know where the runaway convention argument comes from. Where it comes from is really primarily the radical left. And it comes after 1973. We get Roe versus Wade. There's an immediate effort by states to pass Article 5 applications to get into convention to overturn Roe versus Wade. The country was way more conservative back in 1970 than it is today. So it's reacting to that Supreme Court decision in what I would describe as a very appropriate way. At some point along that path, roughly in the early 80s, there's a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, and she ran an organization, a great organization called Eagle Forum. I think she was a great conservative woman in American history. She was a lawyer herself. She unfortunately had become friends with Chief Justice Warren Burger, and he is the Chief Justice who signed Roe versus Wade. He was a leftist activist justice, and they became friends through the Bicentennial Commission on the Constitution. Now, nothing wrong with being friends with someone on the left, especially way back in those days. People were a lot more friendly. But she wrote a letter
Justice
to Burger.
Scalia and Justice Ginsburg were great friends.
There you go. And so she wrote a letter to Burger asking him what he thought about this idea of a convention. Again, remember, the convention's purpose is to overturn the seminal decision of his life. And he, of course, objects to that. And he says, we could have a runaway convention. We could lose our beloved Constitution. So this is really where the idea of a runaway convention gathers steam. It's an effort by radical leftists in America to prevent conservatives from using the Constitution to save the Constitution. And there's a through line there. He and his team go out and they contact professors at Yale and Harvard who write articles about the runaway convention to traditionally leftist institutions. And there's a straight through line all the way to the modern age. 5 years ago on Good Friday, every leftist group in America, everyone whose name you would know, signed a press release. It was all organized by Common Cause and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Or those are George Soros policy organizations. And you can go to Common Cause's website today and see all their arguments, all the runaway convention arguments against the Convention of States. So that's sort of the foundation, Nick, is to understand the arguments come from the left because they don't want folks like us limiting the power of the federal government because they get so much done through the federal government. And then if you move through the steps of how this can't happen anyway, first remember that 34 states have to call a convention and they all have to agree in advance what the convention is about. Those three subject matter areas I talked about, term limits, fiscal restraints, and power restraints, are the subject matter that all 34 agree on in advance. So you get into convention, every state sends its delegation. They can send as many as they want, but they each get one vote. They're going to get there. Let's say someone from New York or California, where I'm originally from, they raise their hand and they say, we need to do away with the Second Amendment. We want to propose the repeal of the Second Amendment. We have 34 states who've already agreed that's not available on the agenda. In legal terms, it's non-germane. And somebody from Texas, where I live now, will raise their hand and say that's not germane. And the chairman or the president of the convention, the parliamentarian, will gavel them out of order and they'll bypass that. Let's say that's wrong. They all go crazy. I don't know, maybe the Californians brought a big hookah pipe and everybody's smoking. And so they've now
Wouldn't shock me. Wouldn't shock me.
No, believe me, I'm from California. That's going to happen. And now let's say it's not ruled out of order. Now you have to get 26 states to agree, for example, to the repeal of the Second Amendment. And if they do, I don't believe you could get 26 states. Remember, we got 34 states that agreed to these limits. Those are going to be primarily Republican-oriented states. So you get, now we say somehow you overcome the magic bar, you get 26 states. Then that repeal, that proposed repeal, it becomes a suggestion. And it goes out to the states for ratification. You have to find 38 states that would be willing to ratify that. And I'll say here on your podcast with a lot of people watching, what I always have said this on Mark Levin's show, on Ben Shapiro's show, on Sean Hannity. My personal email address is mmeckler@cosaction.com. If you can name the 38 states that will ratify that, email me, give me your phone number, and we'll have a personal phone conversation. If you can think of any amendment that, and you're watching, you think it might run away, any amendment you wouldn't like, and the 38 states that will ratify it, then just go ahead and email me and we'll have a conversation. And Nick, I've made that offer to literally millions and millions of people on these shows over the years for 10 years. I've not received an email because you can't do it. And I'll close with this. The numbers matter, right? You can do basic math. If it takes 38 states to ratify, that means it takes only 13 states to stop any amendment we wouldn't like. To stop an amendment, it means a state simply doesn't consider it. They don't have to vote on it and vote no. They just never even bring it up in committee. They never bring it up on the floor of the legislature. And I can tell you, legislators, their favorite thing to do is nothing because it's non-controversial, right? And so it
Absolutely.
takes only 13 states, actually one house in each of 13 states, to do nothing. And let's run some math on the Second Amendment. There are currently, thanks to Florida joining recently, 27 states with constitutional permitless carry. There are 24 states where you can carry your handgun in the state legislature. I've done it in a lot of them where it's legal. And at last count, I believe there are 14 states where you can take a long gun, put one in the chamber, go in, sit in the gallery with your AR across your back and watch the proceedings. I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm just saying it's legal. And the idea that you couldn't get 13 states to stop something like that is just, it's a ridiculous fantasy.
Yeah, and let's be honest, the founding fathers, they put the safeguards in place. That's why they made it such a high threshold. So realistically, the only things that you're really going to be able to get done through a convention of state have to have widespread support, something that crosses over party lines. Like, this is not an ideological thing. I mean, when we talk about term limits, 90% of the American public supports the idea of term limits on Congress, and that spans Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians.
Yep.
So it would be things that actually matter that could maybe get accomplished. And I say maybe because, again, it's such a difficult feat. Now, this week, there's actually Convention of States is doing a simulation, and in full disclosure, I'll be participating in this. So you're actually going to be doing a simulation of what a Convention of States would look like. What's your intent behind this? I think this is a brilliant idea. You held one in 2016, I believe.
Yep.
And so now it's 7 years later. It's amazing how the country has changed in 7
Yes.
years.
Shocking.
So what was the idea behind this?
Well, the idea is there's a few reasons for doing it. I would say the main one is it's a demonstration project, and we want to show the American people how a convention of states would work, what it looks like, how it actually functions. And so what we do is that we invite at least 3 delegates from every state. The majority of the delegates there would either be sitting legislators, retired legislators. There might be statewide elected officials, judges, or something like that. There are people
College
who are
professors and podcast
maybe
hosts.
I was going to go there next. So there are people who are actually, we try to bring in mostly people who are familiar with the political process. This is really important that we do it this way because we're going to cram a convention into 2.5 days or 2.25 days. Obviously, a convention would take a lot longer than that. So they've got to be people who are pretty familiar with legislative process and how all this stuff works so that we can get them in there and they can get to work. Traditionally, if you look at interstate conventions across American history, there have been over 40 of them in American history, not Article 5 conventions, but conventions where states sent commissioners or delegates and they got together and debated and discussed and then passed out proposals back to the states. If you look at those, about 10% of delegates at most of those conventions are non-lawyers, non-legislators, other types of citizens, people like you, professors. And so we try to keep a balance that looks somewhat like history. And I think when you go there, I can't even describe to you how excited I am for you to do this. I'm really excited about it. But what I saw when I was at the last convention, when that thing starts, by the way, Nick, one of the things you're going to see is we have no control over it. We say, ready, go, like we fire the starting gun. And then I step back. As somebody who puts together, it's a little stressful. You don't know what's going to happen, right? And you don't know if it's going to go crazy. Is it going to be a runaway convention like people say? And so you step back, and then I watch people like you, smart people who understand process, who understand history, who understand politics, get into committees and start debating these possible amendments, proposing amendments. I think what you're going to find, what I heard from most participants last time, because I walk the halls, I poke my head in the committee rooms and just kind of be a fly on the wall. People kept walking out of the committee rooms and they would say among themselves or to me, I have to calm down and remember this is not real. I feel like I'm taking it so seriously, like I'm actually debating amendments to the Constitution. And what you'll find is, and I expect you're going to find the same thing, and I know you're going to do the same thing, people who are good people go to that event and they end up, in my opinion, practicing greatness. They step up, they become statesmen and women. The level of discourse, the level of debate, the level of propriety and just gentility among the delegates who have very different opinions, aggressively different opinions, but the level of professionalism is extraordinary. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is live streaming as much of this as possible to the public. So you'll be in there head down in the midst of all this stuff in the fight. people will be able to watch that going on and see what a convention actually looks like.
And I think it's important for people to understand what a convention looks like. I mean, I'm someone that really is frightened by the aspect that there's so many people in this country that really don't know America. They don't know our history, the founding, the Constitution, the importance of the Constitution. They're unaware of God-given liberties. I mean, you have nearly 1/3 of millennials that now support the idea of surveillance cameras in people's homes. So it really is frightening. So you're opening up to the entire public, and it's not based on Republican, Democrat, correct?
It's not. And, if you think about what I said, the 3 subject matter areas, those are not partisan areas. Like, we didn't say, okay, one subject matter area is abortion and another's gay marriage. And, this is intentionally non-policy oriented. In other words, if you go out and if you poll the American people, you said most American people support term limits. Absolutely. Most American people support a balanced budget amendment. About 72% of American people say the federal government does too much. It's too big. And I think that number's probably bigger now. That was polled a few years ago. We might argue on a partisan basis about, well, what should be cut if it's too big? Is it defense? Is it welfare? How should that balance work? But the idea that the federal government's out of control, it's in our lives, it's in our faces. People on the left believe that. People on the right believe that. If you were to boil this whole thing down to a simple question, which I think it can be, the question we're asking is, who decides? Does Washington, D.C. decide for you? Do you decide for yourself, you and your family, you and your community, maybe you and your state? Or is it a bureaucrat, a nameless, faceless bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.? And as Americans, we're widely unified on that. We don't like the idea of the bureaucracies deciding for us. It might be for different reasons. Maybe you're on the left and you hate Trump and you don't like McConnell and you don't like a conservative Supreme Court. It might be you're on the right and you're frustrated with Biden and left-wingers in government, but we all don't like government imposing on us. This is our chance to take power away from DC and give it back to the people and the states.
Yeah, and it's really simple, right? As government has expanded dramatically over the last 100 years, people's lives have gotten much more difficult. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or Libertarian or Independent. It's clear as day that government hasn't been able to solve the problems they usurped the power for. And I think that's interesting. So as far as the simulation goes, where could people watch it?
So people are going to be able to just go to conventionofstates.com. We'll be featuring it right on the main page. They'll just click on simulation and they'll be able to watch the live stream. Mostly we'll be doing the primary debates on the floor in technically what's called the committee of the whole. That's what you call a legislature when the whole legislature is sitting on the floor. We're going to do as much camera work as we can in the committee rooms. That's more complicated. There'll be 3 separate committee meetings going on at one time with between 30 and 50 participants in them, and they'll be working on the various subject matter areas, those 3 subject matter areas. So we will have footage from in there, but definitely consistent footage on the main floor. And then we'll also be doing, if this sounds kind of funny, but I think this is how the real one's going to be when we hold it, I'll be doing color commentary. In other words, I'll be sitting in the committee of the whole and doing some roving reporting, and it'll be kind of like an NFL game, right? My job will be to be at the back of the room. I might pull you off the floor at some point, Nick, like we do player interviews, right? And say, tell me what's going on. What's your delegation trying to accomplish? What do you think about the amendment that was just proposed? And then I'll be sitting there just giving color commentary, like, wow, really interesting. Delaware just tried to insert an additional clause in this amendment about term limits for the bureaucracy. And let's see how the different states vote. Is it regional? Is it large state versus small state? Is it blue state versus red state? So we'll be doing that analysis and color commentary all the way through the convention at conventionofstates.com.
Well, I look forward to the event, and everyone should be aware that after the simulation, we are going to do another podcast episode where we discuss the outcome of the Convention of States and what the process looked like. So I really look forward to this experience. Mark, I appreciate everything you're doing. We're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report where people could go to the Convention of States to watch the simulation. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Hey, great to be with you, man. I am so excited to see you there. So I'm looking forward to it, Nick.